Hey everyone, Dr. Jack Audie, and in this series of videos, I'm going to be breaking down an instruction guide to research. It's a giant topic, but I'm going to take it slow, so hopefully I'm more informative than an IKEA instruction manual. So let's jump into it. First, step one, we're going to develop a research question. Now, this is not an easy task, but hopefully I can talk to you about approaches that will simplify it, and then you can start developing your own interesting and feasible research questions. So let's jump into this. The first thing I wanted to talk about is your research question should build up on a giant pile of previous research. What we don't want to be doing is trying to jump 10 kilometers ahead of the research field. We want to be trying to do an incremental approach. Now that might sound ultra conservative, but it's something that has worked consistently in science, and we end up with massive gains. You know, if you look at the smartphones we've got, the medical treatments we have, particularly for things like childhood cancer, for example, we've made massive advancements. And when you actually follow the history, it has all been a series of very small incremental gains for the most part. And if you don't believe me, look at the greats like Isaac Newton. He said, if I have seen further than others, it's by standing upon the shoulders of giants. And that is an image of the internet, so we 100% know it's true. But let's actually talk about a real example that might be a bit more convincing. So we all know Charles Darwin. Everyone would think he is an absolute pioneer, genius in the field of biology. People would largely believe this man took a greater leap in biological knowledge than any other person in history. But here's the thing. I would argue scientific history wouldn't be that different without Darwin. Now that seems like a bold claim, but Darwin came up with his theories of natural selection and evolution, and he worked on them for nearly 2 decades, and he barely told anyone about this. Now, there's some conflicting theories about why he kept all his theories a secret and not really tell anyone. But one theory, which I think holds some water, is that he understood the ramifications of natural selection and evolution in the sphere of Christian beliefs at the time, which believed that all animals were created by God and not changed through a process of evolution. So Darwin knew that this would get some negative feedback from society. And so some people argue this is why he held on to his results. But then another scientist called Wallace published a letter, and this letter largely summarized natural selection and evolution. And he published it before Darwin had published anything out in the public. And Darwin actually wrote a letter to Wallace saying, hey, man, your ideas were unbelievably overlapping with my ideas. And I've actually been working on these ideas for 2 decades. And they actually had like a little trial in front of the Royal Society to see who should be accredited with natural selection and evolution. And the Royal Society, looking at the 9.5 books that Darwin had written about natural selection and the theory of evolution versus Wallace's letter, they decided that Darwin must have come up with the ideas first and had been working on it a long time. But you can see that the field was ready, and it was just that the idea of evolution through natural selection was right there, and so multiple people were coming to that idea at the same time. And so it was an incremental process. It looks like this giant leap forward, but it was an incremental process. And actually, if you look at the Nobel Prizes, the history of the Nobel Prizes, they give the Nobel Prize to 3 scientists at a time, a maximum of 3 scientists per year per subject. And what often happens is 3 scientists from 3 different research groups make the same discovery, often in the same month or within a couple of months of each other. And so then they are all given the Nobel Prize. This sort of demonstrates the incremental nature of science. It's just that one step forward, and everyone is kind of all ready to take that one step. And that's why we seem to make the same discoveries at the same time in different countries all across the world. Okay, so I'm going to take you through an example, and this is a real example that's happened to me in the last week, right? There was a paper published, have I got it? Oh yeah, by Zhao, 2023 in JAMA. JAMA is a great journal. And these are the results of the paper, right? So imagine we've got 2 people. We've got person A and person B. And person A donates their blood to person B, and then we follow them for a year. And then we look at their risk of stroke. So for this paper, they had over 700,000 people, so they had a lot of people, they had a lot of A's and a lot of B's to follow. So they followed them and they looked at their risk of hemorrhagic stroke. Now, hemorrhagic stroke is a bleed in the brain, and they're actually looking for multiple bleeds, not just one bleed, but multiple bleeds in the brain. And what they found was the risk was about 1 in 1,000. So with this age group and this group of people, around about 1 in 1,000 had a multiple hemorrhagic stroke in their brain. Now, this is where the research question comes in. What happened in this situation? So person A donates their blood to person B again, and 1 year later, but during that year, person A has multiple hemorrhages in their brain. So they have multiple bleeds in their brain during that year. So we know that person A has bleeds in their brain by the end of that year. What is the risk the person B has a hemorrhagic stroke? Now, you remember at baseline, it was 1 in 1,000. So 1 in 1,000 people got multiple bleeds in their brain. But what happens if the blood you got a person from, that person had an hemorrhagic stroke? Does that affect your risk? And that was the big research question that Zhao et al. Went into. And they came up with it was about a threefold risk. So getting a blood transfusion from someone who then gets brain bleeds increases your risk of brain bleeds by about threefold, 3 times, right? So that's the published literature. Those are the stones being piled up. That's the published literature. Now let's ask a research question that would build upon that, an incremental next step in the research. And to me, the obvious one would be, what molecules in the blood are causing an increased risk in brain bleeds? We know that the blood from the person who got brain bleeds was given to person B, and that increased their risk. So there must be something in that blood that increases the risk. That to me is the obvious next question based on this data, right? And nobody's answered this question yet. That's the obvious question after this paper. And I'm sure there'll be now multiple research groups all across the world researching, attempting to answer that question. Okay, so that's research question 1. Let's look at developing a research question. Let's look at a different example. This is a very, very different example. Okay, Nansaro, maybe, et al. What they wanted to do is look at what factors influenced whether people turned up to their doctor's appointment. So they went through the publicly available clinical data about medical appointment attendance, and what they wanted to see is what factors influence whether or not you actually make it to the medical appointment that you've booked. And what they did was they actually compared Indigenous Aboriginal Australians versus non-Aboriginal Australians and looked at the rates of missing the medical appointments. And what they found were that Aboriginal people were 3 times more likely to not attend their medical appointment, right? Now that to me leads to an important research question is, what experiences are Aboriginal people having during their medical appointment that might discourage future attendance, right? Is there something going on? Is there something to do with the relationship of Aboriginal people and the medical institute that's influencing their medical attendance, their attendance to medical appointments? Now, hopefully you can see that these are 2 very different questions that require very different approaches to answering. Now, I would argue this is how I would approach these questions is, one, I would interview Aboriginal people and perhaps non-Aboriginal people as a comparison and ask them about their experience. And, just ask them. That's kind of the obvious thing, right? Is just ask them about their experience. But for figuring out why people are getting brain bleeds after a blood donation, I would seek to quantify the molecules in the blood of the people who go on to have brain bleeds versus the people who do not. There must be something different in that blood. What is it? Let's try quantify those molecules and compare them against blood that does from people that do not go on to get brain bleeds. So it's a quantity rather than a qualitative. And that's really the 2 big, broad types of research with very, very, very different approaches to research. These wings of research are extremely different in their approach, in the way you create hypotheses, in the way you involve your researcher. The relationship between the researcher and what's being collected is completely different. And so it's so different. I'm actually going to break it down into two different series of videos. So qualitative is essentially is trying to look for themes. It's not turning someone's words into data. It's not trying to get someone's experience into numbers. It's an uncountable thing. It's trying to find themes and opinions and much more nebulous ideas, and it requires much more integration from the researcher to really interpret what's the consistent themes across the groups. When you do these sort of open-ended interviews, they can also be observational studies, but it's a qualitative approach. Whereas investigating people's blood and measuring the numbers of molecules and the quantities of each molecules in the blood, that's a quantitative approach. And that is data-driven. That's when you get numbers and you find out that are these numbers different between two groups, or are there relationships between certain numbers? And so these are measurable numerical differences. This is when we turn our research question into numbers in an attempt to answer it. And these two things are so different that I'm going to break them up into two different streams of education. So first up, I'm going to tackle quantitative research. So that's what's coming up next in the next video.